Burkina Faso just did what very few governments would dare to do. It suspended the United Nations office responsible for monitoring human rights inside the country, and now that office is leaving. By November 30, 2026, the UN Human Rights Office in Burkina Faso is scheduled to close its doors. But this is not the United Nations abandoning Burkina Faso, and it is not every UN agency being expelled. This is one specific office at the center of a much deeper confrontation. Because the same institution now shutting down says it once trained nearly 4,000 members of Burkina Faso's defense and security forces in human rights and humanitarian law. So how did a former partner become an institution the government no longer wanted operating on the ground? The answer begins with a decision that shocked Burkina Faso's political system and triggered a direct clash over sovereignty, security, and who gets to judge a country at war. The confrontation did not begin with the United Nations. It began inside Burkina Faso. On January 29, 2026, the Council of Ministers approved a decree dissolving all political parties and political formations in the country. Before the 2022 military takeover, Burkina Faso had more than 100 registered political parties. 15 of them held seats in parliament after the 2020 election. But by early 2026, the transitional authorities had reached a very different conclusion about what that political system was doing to the country. The government said a review of the multi-party system had revealed serious dysfunction. According to the official explanation, the proliferation of political parties had encouraged abuses, divided citizens, and weakened the social fabric. Interior Minister Emile Zerbo described the decision as part of a broader effort to rebuild or refound the state. The decree did more than suspend political activity. It dissolved the parties themselves. The government also moved to repeal the legal framework governing their operations financing and the formal status of the opposition leader. Assets belonging to the dissolved parties were to be transferred to the state. From the government's perspective, the logic was clear. Burkina Faso was already confronting a severe security crisis. Armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State had spent years attacking communities, disrupting agriculture, displacing civilians, and challenging state control. In that environment, the transitional leadership argued that national cohesion had to come before a fragmented party system it believed was no longer serving the country. But there was another way to read exactly the same decision. Eliminating more than 100 political parties did not simply remove administrative disorder. It also removed organized political competition. It weakened one of the main channels through which opposition groups could challenge the authorities. And because political activity had already been restricted since the 2022 takeover, dissolving the parties entirely represented a much deeper concentration of political power. That is the tension at the center of this story. One side sees a wartime state trying to reduce division and rebuild national unity. The other sees a government responding to insecurity by shrinking political space. And neither interpretation can simply be ignored. Because just days after the decree, the dispute stopped being an internal Burkinabe argument. It reached Geneva. On February 5, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Türk publicly called on the authorities to reverse course. And what he actually demanded is important, because it was much broader and much more complicated than the version now circulating online. The reaction from Geneva was immediate. On February 5, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Türk publicly challenged Burkina Faso's political direction. And this is where the story is often distorted. The United Nations did not order Burkina Faso to stop fighting armed groups. It did not tell the government to abandon national security. And it did not issue a legal ultimatum demanding that more than 100 political parties be restored simply because the UN preferred them. The actual statement was broader. Türk called on Burkina Faso's authorities to end what his office described as repression of civic space and to reverse the move against political parties. He urged the authorities to allow greater space for civil society, including humanitarian organizations. He called for respect for freedom of association and expression. He asked for restrictions on political party activities to be lifted. But the statement did not stop with politics. Türk also called for rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access to people in need. He demanded the unconditional release of people the UN considered arbitrarily detained. And he said serious human rights violations needed to be investigated and those responsible held accountable. From Geneva, the argument was straightforward. A security crisis does not suspend a government's human rights obligations. In fact, the UN position was almost the opposite. The more power becomes concentrated during a national emergency, the more important independent scrutiny can become. But from Ouagadougou, the situation looked very different. Burkina Faso was not debating political theory in a peaceful environment. It was fighting armed insurgencies that had killed civilians, displaced communities, disrupted farming, and challenged state authority across significant parts of the country. And that creates an uncomfortable question. How much political openness can a state preserve while fighting an insurgency? There is no simple answer. The danger on one side is fragmentation. A government fighting for territorial control may argue that political paralysis, institutional rivalry, and internal division can weaken its ability to respond. But the danger on the other side is concentration. Once security becomes the justification for eliminating political competition, restricting civil society, or silencing criticism, the emergency itself can become a reason for extending extraordinary power indefinitely. That is why the February 5 statement mattered. It was not simply a dispute over political parties. It exposed two fundamentally different ideas about what a state at war is allowed to do. For the transitional government, sovereignty meant retaining the authority to restructure Burkina Faso's political system according to what it considered necessary for national survival. For the UN Human Rights Office, sovereignty did not eliminate international commitments on political freedoms, humanitarian access, arbitrary detention, and accountability. Those positions were moving toward a collision. And the relationship was particularly complicated because the UN Human Rights Office was not an outsider that had suddenly arrived to criticize Burkina Faso. It had been operating in the country for years. It had worked with national institutions. It had even trained thousands of members of Burkina Faso's own defense and security forces. Yet only weeks after this public confrontation, the relationship would deteriorate dramatically. By April, Burkina Faso would take a step far more serious than simply rejecting a UN statement. It would suspend the Human Rights Office itself. The line was crossed in April. Burkina Faso did not merely reject Volker Türk's criticism. The government suspended the operations of the United Nations Human Rights Office inside the country for an indefinite period. That was a major escalation. The office had been working with Burkinabe institutions monitoring human rights conditions, providing technical assistance and supporting training for defense and security personnel. Now its work on the ground was effectively frozen. But the government's explanation matters. During a United Nations review later that month, Burkina Faso's delegation said the Human Rights Office had taken initiatives without properly considering information provided by the Burkinabe authorities. The delegation insisted that suspending the local office did not mean Burkina Faso was rejecting the entire United Nations human rights system. In fact, it said the country remained willing to cooperate with UN human rights mechanisms. That distinction is critical. Ouagadougou was not announcing that human rights no longer mattered. Its argument was that international oversight had crossed a boundary, that an external office was making judgments about Burkina Faso without adequately incorporating the state's own evidence security context and explanations. For a government placing sovereignty at the center of its political project, that was no small accusation. But April also revealed why critics were increasingly concerned. Burkina Faso was not only challenging an international office. On April 15, the authorities dissolved 118 civil society organizations, citing legal and administrative reasons. The following day, the government ended the mandates of the sitting commissioners of the National Human Rights Commission. The government stressed that the National Commission itself had not been dissolved and said new commissioners would eventually be appointed. Still, taken together, these decisions raised a difficult question. If international monitoring is suspended, political parties are dissolved, civil society organizations are removed, and the composition of the National Human Rights Institution is being reset. Where does independent scrutiny come from? Supporters of the government would answer that independence does not have to mean foreign supervision. Burkina Faso has courts, military justice structures, investigative mechanisms, and domestic institutions. A sovereign state, they would argue, should be capable of investigating its own forces and protecting its own citizens without giving an outside institution the final word. Critics see the danger differently. The more authority becomes concentrated in the executive during wartime, the more important, genuinely independent institutions become, especially when allegations involve the security forces themselves. This is where the story becomes more complicated than Burkina Faso versus the United Nations. It is really a dispute over the architecture of accountability. Who gathers the evidence? Who decides whether an allegation is credible? Who investigates the investigators? And who has the authority to say that the state itself crossed the line? For several months after the suspension, the two sides continued talking, but the dispute was not resolved. And eventually, the consequences became unavoidable. The UN Human Rights Office would announce that it was winding down its presence in Burkina Faso. Yet before we get to that closure, there is one detail that makes this breakdown especially remarkable. The office Burkina Faso suspended was not simply a critic standing outside the system. It had helped train nearly 4,000 members of the very security forces now at the center of the debate. Nearly 4,000. That number changes the way this confrontation looks. According to the UN Human Rights Office, since establishing its Burkina Faso country office in October 2021, it trained nearly 4,000 members of the country's defense and security forces in international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Think about what that means. This was not an institution that had spent years standing completely outside Burkina Faso's security system and criticizing it from a distance. It had worked directly with the people carrying weapons for the state. It had helped train personnel expected to operate in one of the most difficult security environments in West Africa. And at the same time, the office had another job. It monitored and documented human rights conditions and advocated with government institutions when it believed those standards were being violated. That combination creates the paradox. The office could cooperate with Burkina Faso security forces on Monday and still question the conduct of those forces later. From the UN's perspective, there is no contradiction. Training security personnel in humanitarian law does not mean giving them immunity from scrutiny. In fact, the entire purpose of that training is that rules continue to apply when operations become dangerous, confusing, and violent. But from the perspective of a government fighting an insurgency, the relationship can become much more difficult. When soldiers or dying communities are being attacked and the state is trying to regain control of territory, outside criticism can be perceived not simply as oversight, but as pressure on the institutions expected to win the war. And this is where the argument becomes much more serious than a dispute over one press release. Burkina Faso itself has repeatedly said that its military personnel and volunteers for the defense of the homeland receive human rights training. At UN treaty body discussions, government representatives have described training programs, complaint mechanisms, military justice structures, and other domestic systems intended to address misconduct. So Ouagadougou can make a legitimate sovereignty argument. If Burkina Faso already has national courts, military justice training programs, and investigative institutions, why should an international office have such a prominent role in evaluating what happens inside the country? But that question immediately produces another one. Who verifies whether those domestic systems actually work when allegations involve the state itself? Training is not accountability. A law on paper is not an investigation. And the existence of a military tribunal does not automatically prove that every serious allegation will be examined independently. That is the real significance of the 4,000 figure. It shows how deeply cooperation and confrontation had become intertwined. The UN Human Rights Office was not simply an enemy of Burkina Faso's security forces, nor was it simply their partner. It was both a capacity-building institution and an independent monitor. And eventually, those two roles became politically impossible to separate. After the April suspension, intensive discussions between the UN Human Rights Office and Burkina Faso's authorities failed to resolve the dispute. The result was announced in July. The country office would wind down and close by November 30, 2026. But closing the office does not answer the hardest question. It makes that question more urgent. When the external monitor leaves, who will hold the system accountable from inside? And this is where the sovereignty argument faces its hardest test. Because oversight only matters when the allegations are difficult. On February 25, 2024, something horrific happened in the northern villages of Nandon and Soro. Human Rights Watch later accused Burkina Faso military forces of killing at least 223 civilians, including 56 children. The allegation was extraordinary, but so was the evidence behind it. Human Rights Watch said researchers interviewed 23 people, including 14 witnesses to the killings, local civil society figures, and members of international organizations. Researchers also verified photographs and videos provided by survivors. In Soro, multiple images and videos were geolocated. Satellite imagery was used to identify several reported mass graves. Witnesses described a military convoy arriving after Islamist fighters had attacked a nearby military position. According to those witnesses, residents were gathered together before soldiers opened fire. But that is not the only side of the record. Burkina Faso's government rejected Human Rights Watch's conclusions. Government spokesman Rimtalba Jean-Emmanuel Ouedraogo described the accusations as unsupported and overly definitive. More importantly, the government said a judicial investigation into the killings had already been opened after the regional prosecutor reported mass deaths in the area. The prosecutor's original announcement did not identify the perpetrators. It referred to unidentified attackers and called for witnesses to assist the investigation. That distinction matters enormously. An allegation from an international organization is not the same thing as a judicial verdict. But rejecting an allegation is not the same thing as disproving it either. And that is precisely why independent investigation matters. There is also another fact that should not be erased from this story. Armed Islamist groups have committed devastating atrocities of their own across Burkina Faso. Human Rights Watch's 2026 investigation documented grave abuses by both government forces and JNIM, including the August 2024 attack in Barcelona, in which HRW says JNIM killed at least 133 civilians. Civilians are trapped between actors capable of extraordinary violence. This is where one of the most dangerous shortcuts in the narrative appears. Armed groups can steal equipment. Combatants can disguise themselves. Identity in an asymmetric war can be difficult to establish. But those realities do not prove that Nandon or Soro were false flag operations. There is currently no credible evidence that allows us to simply dismiss the allegations against state forces by saying militants were wearing stolen uniforms. The evidence has to be tested. The witnesses have to be tested. The government's account has to be tested. And the investigation itself has to be tested. That is accountability. Not assuming the army is guilty because an international organization says so, and not assuming the army is innocent because the government says so. Burkina Faso has a legitimate argument that justice cannot permanently depend on institutions based outside the country. A sovereign state needs courts, prosecutors, investigators, and military justice systems capable of examining its own institutions. And the government points to domestic judicial reforms and mechanisms as evidence that Burkina Faso is building that capacity. But the test is not whether those institutions exist. The test is whether they work when the accusation reaches the most powerful parts of the state. By early 2026, Human Rights Watch said there had still been no progress in the investigation into the Nandon and Soro killings. That is HRW's assessment, not a judicial finding, but it illustrates exactly why the accountability debate remains unresolved. This is the line Burkina Faso now has to walk. Too much external control can undermine sovereignty. But too little independent scrutiny can undermine public trust. Security without accountability creates one danger. Accountability without understanding the realities of war creates another. The real challenge is building institutions strong enough to deliver both. And that brings us back to the UN Human Rights Office. Because when that office closes on November 30, the accusations will not disappear. The question will simply move inside Burkina Faso. Can the country build an accountability system strong enough that it no longer needs an outside institution to make the world believe its investigations? The Human Rights Office is only one piece of a much larger shift. To understand why Burkina Faso was willing to accept such a serious diplomatic rupture, you have to look at what Ouagadougou has been doing beyond the United Nations. Because this government has been steadily reducing the number of external actors it believes can influence decisions inside the country. The clearest example came on June 26, 2026. Burkina Faso formally broke diplomatic relations with France. Paris confirmed the decision the same day and described it as a unilateral move by the Burkinabe authorities. By July, France confirmed that its embassy and consulate general in Ouagadougou were closed. That did not happen in isolation. Relations between Burkina Faso and France had been deteriorating for years. French military forces had already left the country. French development assistance and budget support had been suspended. French diplomats had previously been expelled, and political rhetoric in Burkina Faso increasingly framed external dependence as a vulnerability rather than a guarantee of stability. But removing old relationships creates an obvious problem. A country cannot simply disconnect from the outside world. It still needs trade. It still needs investment. It still needs security partners. It still needs access to energy infrastructure, technology, finance, and regional markets. So Burkina Faso has not been moving toward isolation. It has been trying to change the architecture of dependence. And this is where the alliance of Sahel states becomes critical. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer treating their partnership as a temporary security arrangement. They are building a broader confederal structure. In May 2026, Burkina Faso's legislature approved 4 additional protocols linked to the AES treaty. Those protocols cover diplomatic coordination, development, defense and security, and confederal parliamentary cooperation. The stated objective is greater coherence between the 3 countries. That includes coordinating diplomatic positions, pooling certain defense and security capabilities, developing cross-border infrastructure, expanding energy cooperation, and strengthening movement within the AES space. That matters because sovereignty becomes much easier to defend when it is backed by regional capacity. If Burkina Faso rejects one foreign partner but has no alternative financing, no regional market, no shared security architecture, and no access to replacement infrastructure, sovereignty can quickly become isolation. But if Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger can actually coordinate defense logistics, energy transport, and diplomacy, then the strategic equation changes. The key word is if. Signing protocols is not the same as building functioning systems. Political solidarity does not automatically create efficient supply chains. A confederation on paper does not automatically produce electricity, roads, investment, food security, or military effectiveness. That is the real test of the AES project. Can these countries convert political defiance into institutional capacity? That question also changes how we should understand the confrontation with the UN Human Rights Office. The closure is not simply a one-off dispute over a statement from Geneva. It fits into a broader Burkinabe strategy: reduce external leverage, strengthen national control, build alternative regional relationships, and shift decision-making closer to Ouagadougou and the Sahel. But there is a danger hidden inside that strategy. Removing external influence is much easier than replacing the functions those institutions once performed. And that is where this entire sovereignty project will ultimately succeed or fail. Not in speeches, not in diplomatic expulsions, not in symbolic confrontation, but in whether Burkina Faso can build institutions strong enough to replace the systems it is pushing away. November 30 is not the end of this story. It is the beginning of the test. Once the UN Human Rights Office closes its country presence, Burkina Faso will still face the same security crisis, the same allegations, the same political tensions, and the same need to prove that its own institutions can function without external supervision. So what should we actually watch? Not speeches, not slogans, not whether one side claims victory. Watch the mechanisms. First, accountability. In the digital age, accountability is paramount. If serious allegations are made against soldiers, police, or volunteers for the defense of the homeland, are those cases investigated quickly? Are findings published? Are victims and witnesses protected? And when evidence points toward wrongdoing, are prosecutions actually carried out? That is the first test. Second, civic space. Burkina Faso has argued that national cohesion is essential during an insurgency. But the longer emergency measures remain in place, the harder it becomes to distinguish temporary wartime restrictions from a permanent political model. Will civil society organizations be allowed to operate? Will journalists be able to investigate sensitive issues? Will citizens be able to criticize state institutions without automatically being treated as threats to national unity? That is the second test. Third, security itself. This may be the most important measure of all. If stronger central control is justified as necessary to stabilize the country, then the results have to appear on the ground. Can displaced families return home? Can farmers work their land safely? Can roads reopen? Can markets function? Can schools and clinics operate in communities that were previously cut off? Government statements in 2026 have claimed further gains in territorial control. Those claims matter, but they also need to be judged against lived reality and independently observable outcomes. Fourth, institutional capacity. Burkina Faso is pushing for greater sovereignty, but sovereignty is expensive. A country that reduces dependence on external institutions has to replace some of the functions they once provided. That means stronger courts, better trained investigators, more credible national human rights institutions, more capable public administration, more transparent military justice, and enough financial and technical capacity to make those institutions work beyond the capital. Fifth, the AES. Burkina Faso is not trying to do this alone. The Alliance of Sahel States is supposed to provide deeper diplomatic security, economic, and development cooperation. If that structure succeeds, Burkina Faso may have more room to pursue an independent political course. If it fails, however, the country could discover that replacing old dependencies is far more difficult than breaking them. And finally, watch the relationship with the United Nations itself. The closure of one country office does not mean Burkina Faso has left the UN system. The real question is whether cooperation continues through other channels. Will Ouagadougou still engage with treaty bodies, humanitarian agencies, development institutions, and technical programs, or will the dispute over human rights monitoring spread into a much broader institutional rupture? That distinction matters, because there are two very different futures hidden inside the word sovereignty. In one future, Burkina Faso builds stronger domestic institutions, improves security, protects its citizens, and reduces dependence while remaining selectively engaged with the outside world. In the other, external oversight disappears faster than domestic accountability can replace it. Both futures are possible. And by November 30, the symbolism will be obvious. The UN Human Rights Office will be gone. But the real verdict will not be written in Geneva. It will be written inside Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has already made the symbolic decision. The harder decision comes next. It is one thing to tell an external institution that the country will no longer accept the same level of oversight. It is another thing to prove that Burkina Faso can build something stronger in its place. Because sovereignty is not measured only by who leaves the country. It is measured by what remains after they leave. Can national institutions investigate serious allegations without political interference? Can soldiers accused of wrongdoing be examined fairly, while those fighting armed groups are also protected from unsupported accusations? Can security improve without turning emergency powers into permanent political restrictions? Can Burkina Faso strengthen its own courts, human rights institutions, investigative bodies, and public administration enough that citizens trust them? Those are much harder questions than whether a UN office stays open. And November 30 will not provide the answer. The closure of the Human Rights Office will only remove one actor from the equation. Burkina Faso will continue engaging with other parts of the United Nations system, including treaty mechanisms that remain active. That matters because this is not a complete rupture with the UN. The real test will happen on the ground. If communities become safer, if displaced families can return, if farmers can work without fear, if allegations of abuse are investigated credibly, and if domestic institutions become strong enough to earn public trust, then Burkina Faso will have a powerful argument that greater sovereignty can coexist with accountability. But if external scrutiny disappears while domestic scrutiny becomes weaker, the argument becomes much harder to defend. That is why this story should not end with a simple declaration that Burkina Faso defeated the United Nations. It did not. What happened is more consequential. Burkina Faso challenged one model of external oversight and accepted the responsibility of proving that another model can work. And that puts the burden of proof where Ouagadougou says it belongs, inside Burkina Faso. So here is the question. When a country is fighting an insurgency, Where should the line be drawn between national sovereignty and independent accountability? Should Burkina Faso have greater freedom to decide how it governs during a security emergency? Or does a crisis make independent oversight even more important? Tell me where you draw that line in the comments. And if you want more evidence-based analysis of Burkina Faso, the Sahel, and Africa's push for greater self-reliance, subscribe to the channel. Because November 30th may close one office, but the real test of Burkina Faso's sovereignty is only beginning. Disclaimer, this video is fictional storytelling created for education, commentary, and entertainment. It is not a factual report or official information. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. Please enjoy it as creative content only.